Hello and welcome to Higher Ed Live, the live weekly web show about the world of higher education, where we talk about digital development, professional empowerment, and issues around the world of higher education that need to be discussed. I am your host, Seth Odell, as always coming to you live from the Mill Yard at Southern New Hampshire University in Manchester, New Hampshire. I am in our new broadcast studio, still mildly under construction, so if you hear some noises in the background, I do apologize, but as always, we are growing at SNHU, staying loud and making things happen. Thank you guys so much for joining me tonight for a very exciting conversation, one I've wanted to have for quite a long time, and I am just so excited to be talking about the student loan crisis and the issue of forgiving student loan debt. And we have a really amazing guest with us, Robert Applebaum, former Brooklyn ADA, founder of ForgiveStudentLoanDebt.com, really a major player in this space right now, and I cannot wait to talk with him in just a matter of minutes. But first, want to thank, as always, our sponsors that help make Higher Ed Live possible. We're sponsored by Omni Update. They are the leading provider of CMS in higher education. The company's web CMS OU campus is secure, scalable, with great tools and features, deployment flexibility, and an awesome user community. Check out how one university recently used OU campus for their printed course catalog. Did some pretty cool stuff. A link is out with that on Twitter with the hashtag HigherEdLive. We're also sponsored by Integral, the creators of the Schools app on Facebook, a private Facebook community to boost enrollment and retention. They recently launched a new killer cross-platform product called Announcements. You can check out all about that as well on the Twitter back channel. And we're sponsored by Scavenger, a Google-funded mobile game about going places, doing challenges, and earning points. Check out what IBM used Scavenger for their Smart Planet initiative. It's pretty cool. They toured college campuses, and students, well, they loved it. And finally, we are also sponsored by the wonderful folks over at Converge Consulting, a measurable multi-channel marketing firm where they help their clients strategize, execute, and analyze their marketing efforts. They have an awesome free webinar coming up with Kyle James, and it's all about inbound higher ed marketing, and it's a free webinar. Check that out as well if you haven't already. Always nice to have extra free content. Again, I am your host, Seth Odell. This is Higher Ed Live. We're talking all about forgiving student loan debt today. If you have any questions throughout the show, please use the hashtag HigherEdLive. It's pound Higher Ed Live. We'll do our best to get those questions answered. And without further ado, I would like to introduce today's guest, who's going to be talking all about the subject with us. So, Rob, without further ado, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited to talk about this topic. It's one that's in the news a lot. It's only been growing. Actually, we had this show scheduled once before, and we had to reschedule because we had press conferences going on. It's not slowing down. So again, I really appreciate you taking the time tonight to talk about it.
I'm happy to be here.
I'm so glad we made this happen. As we dive into this, can you just start off by telling folks a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background, and how you found yourself kind of in the position you're in today, really championing this position, this argument?
Sure. Well, it all happened by accident. I'm an attorney, as you mentioned. I'm a former Brooklyn ADA. After I served for 5 years at the Brooklyn DA's office. After that, I served for another 5 years in the private sector, merely because I needed to pay my student loans back, but that's neither here nor there. And I got involved in this subject because on January 29th of 2009, a mere 9 days after the inauguration of President Obama, they were debating the Obama stimulus package, and 40% of it were tax cuts. In addition to more corporate welfare and trickle-down economics, I got mad. So I wrote an essay called Forgive Student Loan Debt to Stimulate the Economy. And I posted it to a new group on Facebook. And within a week, the Huffington Post had caught on and wrote a story about it. And people started joining in droves. And then, little by little, more and more stories were written about it. U.S. News and World Report, The Washington Times, The New York Times, The Economist, on and on and on. And every time a new story was written about it, more people joined the group. And to be quite honest, when I first started the group, it was because I had what I thought was a better idea for stimulating the economy. Forgiving the student loan debt of 36 million Americans who are educated and who went to school with the purpose of starting businesses and succeeding, were being bogged down by these debts. So using my own example, I knew that I had $500 per month that I was spending in student loans. If I were suddenly relieved of that obligation to repay that $500 a month, I would have $500 per month every month with which to spend on ailing sectors of the economy. So to me, it was a bottom-up approach to rebuilding the economy, to economic stimulus. It had nothing to do with all of the inequities that exist in the student loan industry. I wasn't even aware of them at the time. I had never had problems repaying my student loans. Not that that makes me better than anyone else. I'm just saying that I wasn't aware that there were no bankruptcy protections, for instance, or no statute of limitations on the collections of debt, because none of those things had really impacted my life. So I started this really by accident because I proposed an alternative to economic stimulus, and because of the fantastic membership and following that I have, they morphed the movement into one of economic justice and fairness and equality.
And as you talk about that kind of, you said, like discovering yourself into this role and understanding this issue and learning about, people's experiences with inequality. You brought up the bankruptcy issue, statute of limitations, some very serious things. Why is it you think that there was such a groundswell of support? I mean, what is it about the student loan debt crisis going on right now in this country that leaves so many people eager to find a solution like this and want to come around and rally around a cause that can not only support individuals but also support the economy as well?
Because in the last 30 years, certainly in the last 20 years, tuition rates have skyrocketed. The amount of money that somebody has to borrow to just obtain a bachelor's degree, which is the equivalent of a high school diploma 30 or 40 years ago, it's reached exorbitant heights, and people are drowning in student loan debt while they're struggling to make ends meet. Middle-class wages have gone down, not up, in the last 10 years. And more people go to college each year. So when the economy crashed in 2007, 2008, we had a real crisis on our hands. There was something like 14 million jobs were lost. But people were still expected to pay their student loan debts. And there is no recourse for anybody. So what I think happened is that I started a conversation that was in the forefront of a lot of people's minds, but there was a stigma of shame and embarrassment that comes along with being in debt that I think I helped alleviate. And I think I've helped create a forum in which people feel safe to talk about their debts without being judged. They're now in a community of fellow debtors, student loan debtors, who understand what everybody else is going through. And, over time, this is going on now for 3.5 years since I started this movement, there's a really strong community of people who support one another and really feel empowered to talk about issues that heretofore were a source of embarrassment.
And I got to say, that's a really good point, actually. I think you're really right that there's something to be said that in general, people that are in debt are not necessarily as incentivized as they go out and speak publicly about it and
right.
have these conversations. And that's really an unfortunate thing, because clearly when we need to have these conversations about how to address these issues, people need to be comfortable enough to speak openly. So I think it's a really good point and something that's really exciting to see with the following you have. And again, we're going to talk a lot about the student loan crisis throughout the show. I mean, it's something that's been, to me, access to affordable education is one of the single most important things we can provide, period. I mean, it's one of those transformational things that can impact someone's life. All that said, I first want to just dive in a little bit too and talk more about when you started this. What's the plan? How does this work? How does it play out? I mean, I'm sure it may have morphed a little bit since it started, but what's the
it's
core
morphed a lot.
Well, walk me through that. What was this
Sure.
idea, and where is it now, and how has it changed?
Okay. When I first proposed forgiving all student loan debt as a means of economic stimulus, it was just that. It was an alternative way of stimulating the economy. Rather than corporate welfare, trickle-down economics, and tax cuts, which have proven to be a failure over and over again, I thought I had a better idea. And it works very simply, and it works, ironically, a lot like conservatives' arguments in favor of tax cuts. If you put more money into the hands of people, they're going to spend it. And that's how you build an economy. That's how you grow an economy. Our economy, our GDP, 70% of our GDP is consumer spending. So that engine of our economy was really stalled at the time that I first proposed full across-the-board forgiveness. Now, I stuck with that position for a long time because I had no reason to backtrack and negotiate against myself. But in July of 2011, last year, Representative Hanson Clark went on the floor of the House of Representatives and gave a floor speech calling for student loan forgiveness as a means of economic stimulus. That was music to my ears. That's exactly what I had been talking about for 2.5 years. So I was elated to see this video on YouTube of him making the speech. So I posted it on the group on Facebook, on my own personal profile, on Twitter, everywhere. By the end of that day, he and I were on the phone talking about what I had proposed, which was just, for a poli-sci nerd like me, it's just fantastic. So it was great. So I had it was about a half-hour conversation that Congressman Clark and I had about what I had proposed and what he'd like to do. And over the course of the next several months, I worked with him and his staff and in crafting H.R. 4170, the Student Loan Forgiveness Act of 2012, which was introduced in March of this year. So now I spend the majority of my time rallying around that piece of legislation. And that piece of legislation is very different than a full across-the-board student loan forgiveness as a means of economic stimulus. And I'm sure, during the conversation we'll get into what that bill provides. But the point being that I'm no longer advocating for across-the-board forgiveness for everybody as a means of economic stimulus because that ship has sailed. There's no appetite in Washington for another round of stimulus, even though I continue to believe it would provide a very good stimulus to the economy. I can't tell you how many people I've spoken to who would start a business tomorrow if they didn't have the student loan debt hanging over their heads. So now the focus of the movement is on getting legislation passed.
And let's talk about that legislation, because I definitely want to. You're saying it shifted a little bit. Let's get a little bit into the nitty gritty. Then, so HR 4170. So walk me through what this does do. If it was to pass, what plays out? How does it work on a tangible level?
Okay, it basically provides for a new repayment program. I'm sure you're aware of income-based repayment (IBR), which has some serious limitations. IBR applies only to federal loans, not to private loans. It has a repayment term of 25 years at 15% of your income, although President Obama in October announced changes to the program whereby new borrowers in 2012 or beyond would only have to pay 10% over the course of 20 years. But you also have to be current to enroll in the program, meaning you can't have been delinquent or defaulted on your loans. So arguably, the people who need the help the most, those in default or delinquency, were excluded for participation in the program, which is just absurd. So the new H.R. 4170 sets forth a new repayment program called the 1010 plan. 10% of your discretionary income over the course of 10 years, and the remaining amount is forgiven. So by no means is it a handout or straight forgiveness. It requires people to pay for their education for 10 years at 10% of their income, which is a reasonable amount of money to pay. It sort of equalizes borrowers' footings with respect to tuition costs and whatnot. It sort of makes tuition irrelevant, and everybody would be able to pay 10% of their income over the course of 10 years and then get their remaining amount forgiven. The way it differs from IBR is, first, the terms, 10 years, 10%. It's better than 20 years at 10% or 25 years at 15%. It also doesn't require you to be current on your loans. So like I said, those who need the help the most are eligible for enrollment. It doesn't matter if they've gone into delinquency or default. It also differs from IBR in a very important respect, which is that it allows you to take out a new direct loan to pay off any private loans you have, and then enroll the new direct loan into the 1010 program. So basically, it's like taking out a new consolidation loan that's eligible for enrollment in the program. So you can pay off your private student loans. And what's really great about it for people like me who have been in repayment for a long time, if this bill were to pass, a lot of people who have been paying the equivalent of 10 years at 10% of their discretionary income would almost immediately qualify for forgiveness, which would be economically stimulative because it would be providing a jolt to the economy, putting money into the hands of people who will spend that money. So in my opinion, it's a great compromise. Would I have liked to have seen full across-the-board forgiveness? Sure. But I'm a realist, too. I know that what I proposed was radical and unlikely to ever happen. I'm not crazy. I just, I took a provocative position on something and I stuck with it until there was a reason to negotiate and compromise. So until Congressman Clark came along, there was no reason to compromise or to negotiate against myself. Now that he came along and was willing to work on H.R. 4170 and introduce this piece of legislation, that is what I'm advocating for now. And I think it's a great alternative for people, and I think it would benefit people in countless ways.
I think one of the key points you're totally right that you talked about is how HR 4170 would impact private loans. Because, I mean, it seems that if we don't address the private loan issue, we're not going to be really providing any sort of solution to this problem at all. I mean, there's just such a massive amount of private loan debt out there, and it's such a really unfortunate and dangerous industry. I mean, if you follow, obviously, there's a reason why like Title IV was passed to impact how for-profits were marketing towards students, because this issue that students could so quickly get into this level of debt. So just to provide the question that I'm sure you've been asked a million times, if a student knowingly takes out a loan, why should they still be supported and have that forgiven? Why do they sort of deserve a bailout, if someone that disagreed with this might call it that?
Right. Nobody deserves a bailout. Not the banks, not the auto companies, not the insurance companies. It's not a question of deserving a bailout. What we're trying to accomplish here with this bill and with the notion of student loan forgiveness is to put education back in the public's mind and public's priorities as an investment in our future, as a collective good that benefits all of society. Not an educated citizenry benefits the entire country. And, if you get sick, you go to your doctor, you're relying on his education. Same goes for lawyers and the accountants and nurses and teachers and on and on and on. We rely upon educated citizens to function in this society. And if we're bogging them down with all of this debt and not allowing them to realize their full potential, then what's the point of them obtaining an education in the first place at all? And so, well, I'll just stop there because I don't want to babble.
No, but I think it's a very fair point. I mean, the reality is access to education is more important than ever in this country, and we're really kind of heading towards a tipping point. People have heard me talk about it before on the show, but with the absolutely insane rate at which tuition has been rising in this country, dramatically higher than inflation. We have, people that don't have access to education. We obviously have slipped down to 11th or 12th most educated country in the world for higher education standards. We were once the first. I mean, President Obama has a 2020 plan, but little that I've seen of any strategy to actually get there without providing students an ability to find an affordable education. That's, lower income, first generation minority students that can find an affordable education. And it's becoming harder and harder than ever. So, I mean, this is something that rings true very much for me. So, that said, I got to ask the next tough question, too, because after that one, which is, what about people that already paid their debts? What about someone who says, well, hey, I worked hard. I just paid all my debts off. Do I get, a refund? Or where's the cutoff for that? And what happens to those individuals?
To be honest, when we were working on drafting the bill, putting a rebate for people who repaid their loans already was one of the considerations. But in order to keep the cost of the bill down, we had to nix that section. Would I have preferred it stayed in? Absolutely. So unfortunately, to be blunt, my answer to those people who have already paid off their debts is good for you, but I'm sorry, you're not eligible. Now, I know firsthand what that's like because the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Plan came into effect in 2007. I left the DA's office in 2004. So I missed that boat too. Life's not fair and we can't cover everybody, but if we can make a major dent into the debt of America's educated people, then I think we'll go a long ways towards, equity in higher education. Another thing I would say to the person who is able to pay off their student loan debt is, number one, you probably went to school at a time when tuition rates were significantly lower. And number two, by virtue of the fact that you have paid off your student loans, you're obviously making enough money to get by. So you're not the person that I'm too concerned about. Mm-hmm. And just to be honest.
And I think, not speaking for myself only, I would hope that someone in that situation would have the ability to recognize their ability to pay that off and have compassion for folks that are not in the same position. So I certainly would hope that. I want to follow up with one point you brought up. So obviously the reason for this is that you wanted to bring the cost of the bill down.
Yes.
I mean, what is the cost of the bill, and are you also able to put that into context for someone like me who, I mean, you could say billion, trillion, million, and I wouldn't maybe necessarily understand the scale of it compared to maybe other bailouts in the past, other things. So what's the cost, and what does that look like realistically?
Well, CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, did not score this bill because it's just introduced and put into committee. There haven't even been hearings on it, so there's no actual price tag on it. The way it was formulated was we were going to pay for it with savings from the wars. As the wars wind down and there's savings to be had there, it would be applied towards this program. But just to put it into context, if Congress and the president had listened to me in 2009 and forgave the student loan debt of all Americans, it would have cost less than one TARP. TARP cost $700 billion. The bailout, the stimulus package rather, cost $787 billion. And then there were $16 trillion in secret loans that the Fed gave out to the very companies and institutions that brought down our economy. So yes, we're talking about a lot of money, but we're not talking about anywhere close to what corporate America gets and has gotten. And I think for one time to apply it to people in the middle class and educated Americans, that, the cost be damned. It's worth it.
And I think when you compare it to the bailouts, I mean, it is a pretty shocking thing. This is a sort of an obvious question to me, but I suppose it has to be asked since it hasn't been out. So why not? I mean, what was the response in 2009? Why was it that we're bailing out private corporations and we're not bailing out citizens who are educated and doing their part to try and pay back their debt and contribute to society and work, who would clearly spend the money that they saved? I mean, why not? What was the argument then, and has that argument evolved at all, or is that still what you're hearing today?
I'm still hearing the same types of arguments. I mean, when I initially proposed the essay, when I originally wrote the essay that proposed forgiving all student loan debt, Congress was in the midst of debating the Obama stimulus plan. They weren't listening to some guy in New York with a laptop and a little too much time on his hands. In the 3 years since, the same type of blowback has been about fairness and the notion that you took out a loan, you should pay it back without considering. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, I just have to say,
I hit a nerve.
That makes me so mad because how is that argument can't be applied to private corporations? That they're the ones that are at fault, that they're in debt, that they made bad business deals. It's their fault that they made risky loans or did risky financial activities that are now coming back to, home to roost. I just don't. How is that fair? That's so frustrating to hear that argument.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it drives me crazy because, especially the argument that you borrowed it, you should pay it back. Well, you know what? In the 3.5 years I've been doing this, I haven't come across anyone who doesn't want to pay back what they borrowed. What they have a problem with is paying back 5 times what they borrowed. Mm-hmm. And that's the norm. I don't know if that's 5 times, it's the exact figure, but people pay significantly more back than what they borrowed, thanks to capitalized interest and the fees and penalties that these banks and lenders have. They have collections powers that, as Elizabeth Warren said at one point, would make the mob envious. And it's true. And in 2005, we gave them even more powers.
Yeah, it's like you said. I think it's a very important saying that it's not that anyone doesn't want to pay this back, and it goes back to interest rates, and especially again with private loans. But it's a very. I agree. There's no one that doesn't want to. It's just that the reality, people get saddled with this debt the last 30 years plus. People that are unable to ever buy a home or have difficulty starting a family. I mean these are things and I speak from personal experience as well. Spending well close to 5 figures a month for a long time for my wife and I. It's a real problem. And again, I'm very grateful for my education, and I'm happy that we're well on our way to paying it back. And I'm proud of that. But it's a very real burden. So
right, and not everybody's as fortunate.
Yeah.
People, especially in the wake of the worst economic climate since the Great Depression, where middle-class wages have gone down, not up, but tuition has skyrocketed. So, we're not in the same landscape that we were even 10, 20 years ago, where people made enough money after graduating where they can reasonably repay their loans. We've long passed the point where tuition rates have any connection, any sort of rational connection to the salaries one can expect upon graduating. So, in this notion of a bailout for students, it's really out of necessity more than anything else, because we're going to reach a breaking point.
I definitely think there's a breaking point coming, no question. It's a scary one to think about because the problem without a bailout is we are getting to a point that schools increase their tuition, students take out loans. They take out loans that are larger and larger that they can't pay back, but they don't realize their inability to pay that back until years later when they're finished and they're gone. And so it means the purchase decision and the impact of that purchase are so far separated, and the numbers for a 17-year-old, 18-year-old especially, I mean, folks going back to school as well, but for your younger generation, it's almost impossible to fully grasp what the kind of a cost could be, what the burden of that could be. I know, again, I speak just from my personal experience, and I'll take responsibility as an adult. It's my own job to know these things, but there was no education on the part of the school or the part of the lender or of anyone else.
Or in high school.
Yeah.
We don't teach financial literacy.
At all. That's a very fair point. And we leave this entire generation of students year after year to make the biggest financial decision of their entire lives until they hopefully, if they ever can, maybe afford to buy property. And even then, this may be more expensive than that. And they make this financial decision at an age when they have no support system largely, unless they're lucky enough to have a family that's helping them figure this out. And they make this, and then they're left, I agree, just saying, help me figure out how to pay this back or make this at least work. The thing I love about a 10% 10 years plan is it's not just saying, okay, it's over. I think you talk about, compromising. Okay, this is a very fair compromise, and it makes sense. So when I look at why this hasn't picked up and why there have been bailouts for private corporations and not for hardworking citizens that are simply looking for an avenue to a solution, it obviously gets political, as anything like this would. So talk to me a little bit more about the politics of this. Is this completely divided, Democrat, Republican? Where's the support for this coming beyond your connections now? Is there a dialogue about this right now in the political world at all? I mean, where is this standing with politics in mind?
Well, you're absolutely right that, ultimately it becomes a political question. And with respect to who has co-sponsored the bill, it's purely been Democrats. Hanson Clark is a Democrat, and the 20 other co-sponsors of the bill are Democrats. So I haven't seen any real support on Capitol Hill from Republicans. That said, a ton of the people who follow me identify as either Republicans, conservatives, libertarians, but because life's lessons have taught them that this is an impossible proposition to repay their loans, they're on board. So, I think that this issue cuts across all political, generational, geographic lines. If you're affected by it, it doesn't matter what party you're from or what your ideology is. You want a solution. So I think if more members of Congress were in student loan debt, we'd see a solution a lot faster. Unfortunately, half of Congress are millionaires. So they're completely out of touch. They have no idea what the average person is struggling with day to day.
And I think it brings up a point, too, with anything that's in the political sphere that who's lobbying for this. Obviously, we don't have major corporations behind this. Exactly. We have individuals like yourself who've taken this upon yourself to say, I am going to fight for this. And you're not backed by huge corporations, and there's not 10,000 of you, and you're not marching around meeting with senators. I mean, this entire world of politics obviously works very differently. So let me ask the hard question then. You are not, alone in this, but you are certainly on the front lines, and there are a thin front lines compared to that of lobbyists, of major corporations on the other side of things. Where do you see this moving forward? And what is your hope for this? I mean, are you still hopeful that this can pass, that this can happen? What do you see when you look ahead?
Well, as I look ahead, I don't see anything happening during the 112th Congress. This do-nothing Congress has made a decision that they're going to stand in shoulder-to-shoulder opposition to anything the president wants to do. So Congress is just not going to act on this year. I've resigned myself to that fact. It's unfortunate. I'm hopeful that they'll at least hold hearings on the bill. Just yesterday, in fact, we had a Twitter bomb event where I encouraged the million-plus people who have signed the petitions I've authored in favor of the bill to participate in a Twitter bomb event where I asked people to tweet individual members of the House Education and Workforce Committee with the hashtag Listen to the million being a reference to the million-plus people who have signed the petition. And we actually trended nationwide yesterday afternoon. And that was a great accomplishment as far as I'm concerned. But has there been a response from Congress? Of course not. So, I think that they're just going to sit by and wait, see what happens in November. But I am hopeful because, like you and I both said, we're going to reach a breaking point. And ultimately, we're going to reach a point where this is an issue that's going to have to be dealt with one way or the other. I'm advocating that we be proactive about it and we do something before there's a whole economic collapse surrounding it. But if we're not proactive about it, we're going to reach a point where we're going to have no choice but to react to it. And it's not going to be pretty. It's going to be very reminiscent of the subprime mortgage crisis.
Mm-hmm. Now, so when you mentioned the size, over 1 million people, that's a good question to bring up, actually put some context to this conversation, which I haven't asked this previously. Tell me about your following, the folks that are involved in this conversation. How big, how are folks being involved? What are they doing? How are they participating? How big is this movement?
Well, it started with one guy and a laptop in his living room. That'd be me. And, within a week, 1,000 people had joined because the Huffington Post had written a story about it. And within the month, there were, 4 or 5 stories written about it. Ultimately, the Facebook group that I initially created reached about 300,000 members. And then Mark Zuckerberg decided to change the formats of Facebook groups and archived old format groups, which I later learned means gets deleted. So I had to start over. But I have a great core of about 10,000 followers on Facebook. Less on Twitter, but my real success has come from authoring petitions. And the first petition I authored was the day after Hanson Clark and I spoke on the phone, as I told you earlier. He introduced a resolution calling on Congress to pass legislation to forgive student loan debt. That resolution was HRES 365. Even if it had passed unanimously, it still would have required legislation. It was just a sense of the Congress kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So I started a petition in favor of that, and that got about 660,000 signatures. Wow. Then, when the H.R. 4170 was introduced in March of this year, I started a new petition. And as of today, there are over 150,000 on top of the million who have signed. It is the most successful petition in signon.org's history, signon.org being the petition site run by moveon.org. I also started a petition on the White House's We the People site back in September of 11. And that's when they first unveiled their petition site. They promised that any petition receiving 5,000 votes would receive an official response. I got 5,000 signatures in 24 hours. Then they changed their requirements to make it 25,000 as the threshold because I guess, 5,000 in 24 hours kind of scared them. So didn't matter. I got 32,000 signatures on that. And I have the distinction of being the very first person to receive an official response from the White House using their We the People site. And that the very next day after I received my official response, that is when President Obama spoke in Denver unveiling the Pay-As-You-Earn initiative, which, as I talked about earlier, alters the terms of IBR.
And I assume was in the response. I'm just curious. Is that they just basically told you what their planned announcement was?
The New York. They told me yes. Essentially, in the response, they told me what they were going to do, and the New York Times reported that the White House advisor on domestic affairs, I'm not sure her title, Melody Barnes was her name at the time, had said it was a direct response to my petition. They said it was a message heard loud and clear, wow. Which was great, on a personal standpoint, but it was not heard loud and clear because what they proposed had nothing to do with forgiving student loans as a means of economic stimulus. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, it was great to get a response and to see, a White House and administration that actually was responsive to the people.
So I know as we talk about politics, one of my biggest concerns with issues related to higher education in general is the upcoming election and the fact that that education is just not on the tip of the tongue of anyone either seeking election or seeking re-election, it seems, at this time. How do you see this playing out in the upcoming election? Is this going to be an issue? Can we make it an issue?
I'm trying.
And how does that look? I mean, what do you try? I mean, are we just essentially, I mean, is this up to the people, the masses, to speak loud enough that we force politicians to respond to this? We force this to be a debate question. We force this to be something that they have to go on the record on right at a time when they are being as strategic as possible with what they say, and maybe force those answers if they're not necessarily forthcoming with them on their own?
Yeah, I'm extremely gratified by what I've accomplished with my petitions and, the movement. However, I don't think a chorus of 1 million plus people is loud enough to break through the debate going on. So what I plan on doing is to just keep doing what I've been doing all along and building this coalition. And eventually we're going to reach critical mass where there's going to be too many people to be ignored. Apparently Congress thinks that 1 million people is no big deal. We can just ignore them. But, if we get up to 25 million or beyond, I'm just throwing out numbers there, but, there's going to be a point where we cannot be ignored any longer. So it is my intention to do everything I can to make student debt an issue in the 2012 campaign, not just at the presidential level, but at the congressional level as well. I have over 1 million people at my disposal who will agree with me and will vote for candidates who support student debt reform. I hope to have many more.
And let's talk about that because in this pace of this, this conversation, it's something that's very ringing true with me and my own ideals and my own beliefs, not only on access to education, but also just economics and understanding the economy and what seems to make the most sense for this country. How do people get involved? What can they do? How can they participate to be a part of this?
Well, they could go to my website, forgivestudentloandebt.com, one word, and there are posted all of the resources that are needed for somebody to get involved. In fact, one of the things that I have as sort of a sticky note on top of the website is welcome new members. You click on that, and it'll tell you step by step how to get involved, what to do, how to tweet members of Congress, to call, to write letters to the editor of your newspaper, making noise. That it comes down to a bunch of citizens making noise and operating on the principle that the squeaky wheel gets the grease. If they want to learn more about the legislation itself, they could go to hr4170.com, and there they'll find frequently asked questions, a bill summary, ways in which to promote the bill to their members of Congress or to basically any member of Congress or the White House. So those two sites, forgivestudentloandebt.com and HR4170. Also, if people want to share their story, because I think this is a very important part of the movement and why we've been successful. My friend Kyle McCarthy, he is the director of outreach for the documentary Default, the student loan documentary. He's back last October started OccupyStudentDebt.com. And that's basically a Tumblr, much like the We Are the 99% Tumblr that was in the news a lot last year, where people just come and share their student loan stories and share the hell that they've gone through as a result of these debts. That's a big part of raising awareness, I think, putting human faces on the crisis and getting involved. So forgivestudentloandebt.com to see how you can get involved in the movement, hr4170.com to find out more about the bill and ways in which to promote it, and occupystudentdebt.com where they can share their stories about student loan hell.
Now, one more question I have for you, too, actually, before we begin to wrap the show up a little bit here. Just a curiosity question. We know, obviously, President Obama has his own opinions on how to approach this issue. What happens if Mitt Romney wins the upcoming election? I mean, how do you see that playing out, and how do you see him playing this? Part of the reason I ask is people have heard me talk about in this show before. He has very strong connections to the for-profit industry in higher education, with Full Sail University in particular being a major donor, at least some folks involved with Full Sail. He's also talked a lot before about Title IV, possibly repealing some of that, which is putting restrictions on debt-to-income ratios for students, especially it's essentially targeting the for-profit industry, making sure they are recruiting students fairly and students aren't leaving with too much debt. They are having career success. He's a very polarizing figure, I think, in some capacities with higher education issues in general. So how do you see him playing into this if he is to win election this time, in November?
It scares me to no end, the prospect of Mitt Romney winning this election, because I can tell you that even if we were to somehow pass the Student Loan Forgiveness Act through Congress, I strongly suspect that he would veto it. Just like you were saying, I mean, with his ties to for-profit universities, just his comment a couple of weeks ago where all Americans should get as much education as they can afford, just reflects such an attitude towards education and an entitlement for the rich, but where people who can't afford education really aren't entitled to it. I'm very scared about a Mitt Romney presidency. I don't think there's any hope of getting stuff like this passed, or eventually we're still going to reach a breaking point, whether Mitt Romney or Barack Obama is president after November. But I think our chances of doing something profound and profound are much, much better with President Obama being reelected.
I certainly agree, and I think your point is well taken. That this is sort of a dead end road that we're heading down. It's just a matter of how soon we prepare for the end of it, and it's a very scary thing. I think the more and more time that goes by, the more and more citizens are saddled with increased debt as tuition increases. More students are being saddled with this debt. Less students are getting access to education that can help them transform their lives. Obviously, separating the income gaps, it's a scary thing all the way around. And I totally agree that it's something that concerns me a lot as we sit back, and it feels sometimes as a country sit on our hands a little bit as this problem is playing out directly in front of us and is relatively inevitable without some direct course of action. So for that, again, I have to say that I'm very grateful for having individuals like yourself out there championing this and pushing this conversation forward. I think it is an incredibly important conversation, and one that I'm not seeing had nearly enough. And I certainly hope that you are able to continue to build your following enough that you're continuing to get the media coverage that you've been getting and deserve, and push this forward even more into a conversation. Because I do believe, I have to believe on an individual level that people understand this. Like you said, it's not politically, certainly it can be polarizing, but I do believe, as you mentioned, that this is not a political issue on a personal level. And when you talk to your neighbor, your friend, your family member, a member in your church congregation, or someone down the street, I don't see this being a polarizing political issue at all in that capacity. But that takes all of us using our voice to have that conversation, not waiting for politicians to have it, not waiting for this to come up, being asked in a question in an election. Debate. We have to have this conversation now.
Right.
And
I couldn't agree more.
And I just can't thank you enough for having it. So with that, before we wrap this up, what are your final thoughts for folks watching? What are the things you hope they take away? What do you hope they maybe get off their butts or get out their fingers on the keyboards? What do you hope that they do, if nothing else, to make sure we push this issue forward?
Well, if nothing else, I think I'd like to be an example to other people, to show that, there's nothing special about me. I got mad one day and I wrote an essay and I stuck with it because, there was an injustice that I saw. I'm an attorney. I have a very strong sense of fairness and justice and equality. I saw an injustice being perpetrated and I saw that nobody was talking about it. So I talked about it and I stuck with it. And anybody else can join me. Anybody who's passionate about this issue can join me. They can go to the websites that I mentioned and they can get involved. I'm very accessible. My email address is out there for anybody who wants to talk to me. I respond to almost every email I receive, which consumes a lot of my time. And, hopefully people will just get involved in the movement and make some noise and don't give up. The secret to my success has been unrelenting persistence.
And I think it's a lesson that folks can learn. I hope they will take that as an incentive to kind of stand up, stand by you, and be one voice for this. I know I am certainly behind that and want to be involved in that as well. So Robert, thank you so much for coming on Higher Ed Live tonight and having this conversation.
Pleasure.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Robert. Thank you guys for watching. And obviously, forgivestudentloandebt.com. If you have not, get over there immediately. Read up. If you still have any questions, there's a huge frequently asked questions section on that site. Lots of information, lots of ways to get involved. The one thing you have to do if you're watching is be informed and get involved in any capacity. Have an opinion, be informed, and share this information. A lot of us, this is a passionate issue for a lot of us, but I will be the first to say that this is not the kind of thing that's at the tip of my tongue when I'm out having dinner with a few friends or seeing old family members or anything else. And maybe it needs to be. Maybe it needs to be the kind of issue that we're talking about with the people that matter to us most and the folks that we care about. And if we're all comfortable enough to speak about it, maybe we understand the depth of this issue and why it's so important to address it. So thank you guys for watching Higher Ed Live and this conversation about forgiving student loan debt. As always, this episode and every episode is archived at higheredlive.com. We have a month full of action-packed content coming up. We're going to be updating the upcoming shows calendar tomorrow, over the weekend as well, with lots of new shows. Please check back. And as always, thanks for being part of the network, putting the conversation forward, and fighting for things you believe in. This is Higher Ed Live. I am Seth Odell from the Mill Yard in Southern New Hampshire University. Take care, and I will see you guys next time.